Well, I'll whet your appetite then. One of the most famous paragraphs in historical literature. Do you know, actually, I used to do this with some of my classes here. I actually first proposed it as a joke, but people took me seriously. I asked them if they could memorize this entire paragraph. I would give them extra credit on the final exam. And one student actually got every single word right. And I gave that student 5 whole points. But then because they spent all their time memorizing this, they didn't do very well in the exam, so it didn't help them. So I think it's a bad idea. I'm not going to do that again. But here it is. The most famous sentence in 20th century historical writing, the most famous paragraph, that is. So gorgeous was the spectacle on the May morning of 1910, when 9 kings rode in the funeral of Edward VII of England, that the crowd, waiting in hushed and black-clad awe, could not keep back gasps of admiration. In scarlet and blue and green and purple, 3 by 3 the sovereigns rode through the palace gates, with plumed helmets, gold braid, crimson sashes, and jeweled orders flashing in the sun. After them came 5 heirs apparent, 40 more imperial or royal highnesses, 7 queens, 4 dowager, and 3 regnant, and a scattering of special ambassadors from the uncrowned countries. Together they represented 70 nations in the greatest assemblage of royalty and rank ever gathered in one place, and of its kind, the last. The muffled tongue of Big Ben told 9 by the clock as the cortege left the palace. But on history's clock, it was sunset. And the sun of the old world was setting in a dying blaze of splendor, never to be seen again. Well, as you can see, I don't have it memorized yet, but I should. Now, Tuckman, the lady knew how to turn a paragraph. You'll notice how many one-syllable words there are. I think you'll all appreciate that. Nice, short, simple words. What she's getting at here is obviously this whole nostalgia for the world destroyed in 1914. I mean, to some extent, she did a different thing with her book, with this article on socialism, where she was looking at all the kind of undercurrents of violence and so on. But what's great about her historical prose is it brings out the drama. It brings out the idea that it didn't have to happen. I mean, if you think about history, you know, structurally, you have alliances and economic forces and politics, socialism as opposed to militarism and nationalism. If you look at it in the big structuralist picture, then yeah, of course it made sense that this war happened kind of roughly when it did. There were these alliances, they were hostile, the Ottoman Empire was falling apart, you had the Balkan Wars, you know, this and that. But history's not really like that. I mean, nothing is ever completely writ in advance. Things didn't have to happen the way they did. I mean, Germany did not have to have this Schlieffen Plan, which forced Germany to be so paranoid about its mobilization schedule. Yeah, you hear about that too. You hear about the timetables. The war came about because the politicians lost control. You know, the generals and the railway technicians had taken over, and so everything came down to the clock mobilization timetable. The Germans have to be in Paris on day 42, so there's not a moment to lose, and so they had to mobilize. They had to, they didn't have to. In the end, the decisions were made by real live human beings. Schlieffen himself made this decision, a real live human being who designed the plan. And actually, the second chapter in the Tuckman book, which begins with a character sketch of Count Alfred von Schlieffen, has my other favorite sentence in the book. You know, she's talking about Schlieffen and how single-minded he was. You know, and she said, it is said that once, you know, as the sun was setting on a beautiful day, he and one of his staff officers, you know, they're riding through East Prussia. They come upon this river. The sun is setting. You know, it's shimmering, beautiful scene. And his officer says, look at the river Pragel, I think it's called, you know, sparkling in the setting sun. Schlieffen picks up his glasses and he says, an unimportant obstacle. And she writes, so too, he decided, was Belgian neutrality. That is, that Germany had to invade France by way of Belgium, you know, thus, as the phrase had it, let the last soldier on the right brush the English Channel with his sleeve. I'll give you maps on Friday. I know you should have maps. The idea then that they're going to envelop Paris from the north and the west. Now, the plan, again, was strategically, shall we say, not very wise, because Belgian neutrality had been guaranteed by treaty signed by all the powers, notably Britain, who had actually created Belgium. So that in a way, this guaranteed British entry into the war. In a way, but remember, nothing is ever completely decided in advance. And in fact, the plan was not set in stone. The original Schlieffenplan, as I think I wrote down here, was modified substantially by Moltke. Moltke the Younger, as he's called. He was not the son of the elder Moltke, the one who had been the victor of the Franco-Prussian War. He was actually his nephew. But he's called Moltke the Younger usually in most of the books. Moltke the Younger, yeah, he didn't have Schlieffen's single-mindedness. He kept sort of changing the plan a little bit. He was thinking, well, yeah, it would be great to have that last soldier on the right brush the channel with his sleeve. But if we're really going to do that, that means we have to go through Holland as well. So we have to invade not only Belgium, but Holland on the way to France. And for Moltke, that was a step too far. He thought, maybe we don't make it to Paris by day 42, then we might need to trade with the world. And so we need Amsterdam, you know, to be open for trade. And so he says, okay, well, he's going to weaken this side. So it goes from here to kind of like about here, maybe. And it's not quite as dramatic as the old plan. Then as it was actually being carried out, he even weakened the right further to reinforce this side, thinking that he could instead do a canet. A canet is what happens when you let the other army go into the pocket and you trap them and surround them from behind. So the plans were not set in stone. Moltke kept changing Schlieffen's plan, whether for good or for ill. The plans mattered, yes, but they were not set in stone. And in a way, none of this might have ended up leading to war if it were not for what Bismarck, of course, famously called the inevitable accident, or some damn fool thing in the Balkans. Well, what was the damn fool thing? As we all know, it was the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. I wrote up here an interesting phrase. You don't need to remember this, but what you sometimes see in the books is that he was killed along with his morganetic wife. Now, what did that mean? It meant she was a commoner. He had essentially disobeyed the protocols of the Habsburg dynasty by marrying a common woman, who was not noble-born. And she was certainly not noble-born high enough to, merit the rank of Habsburg. This was significant because Franz Ferdinand, there's a weird idea that some people apparently had in Serbia that he was a warmonger. He was anything but. He was actually more or less a pacifist. He was actually rather close with Kaiser Wilhelm II. And to the extent he had any ideas at all that were coherent, I think he wanted to create a kind of union of some of the South Slav states inside the monarchy. He wasn't an appeaser exactly, but he definitely was not a warmonger. He was not particularly anti-Serbian. And so when the Serbs killed him, in a way they killed one of the leading advocates for peace. Some people said this was like the perfect scenario for those in Vienna and Berlin who wanted war. It was not only like a pretext to casus belli, but it got rid of one of the main obstacles. Now that said, he was now heir apparent only because his own brother had died, because they had tried to disown him after he married a commoner. The reason this matters a little bit is that part of the reason he went to Sarajevo was to give his wife a sort of ceremonial tour. But she didn't get to go to all the balls in the palaces because she was a commoner. He had sort of disgraced the family. And so part of what he was doing was actually a gesture to his wife. Officially, he was in Bosnia to observe military maneuvers, Habsburg military maneuvers on the Serbian frontier, which raises some very interesting questions about the Russian alibi. That is, that Russia supposedly didn't know about it or had nothing to do with it. Russia's military attaché in Serbia was on vacation in Italy at the time of the Sarajevo incident. Interesting. Because the whole thing was to stage military maneuvers, which presumably Russia's military attaché would have wanted to witness. That said, there's no proof one way or another about Russian involvement or complicity. But about Serbian complicity, there's no longer the remotest shadow of a doubt. I should have written his name over here. Let's see, I'll write it somewhere. We'll just call him Apis for short. He had this great name, Dragutin Dmitrievich. Call him Apis so that we can just kind of keep it short and simple. This was his code name. Head of Serbian military intelligence. We now know beyond a shadow of a doubt that he organized the whole operation of kind of training and providing with weapons the young terrorists of the Young Bosnia faction, which was itself an offshoot of the Black Hand, which was this terrorist organization basically run by Serbian military intelligence. We now know this. The Serbs were absolutely complicit. guilty, etc. At least Apis was. He, in fact, confessed to the crime in 1917. Now, the actual assassin, Gavrilo Princip, is curious because they actually did not execute him. And he was interviewed 3 years later, sometime in like late 1917. And he was asked, do you have any regrets about killing the Archduke Ferdinand, launching a war that mobilized 62 million people and killed 10 million people? Do you have any regrets? And he said, no. If I hadn't done it, the Germans would have found another excuse. Well, spoken like a Serb, obviously, who saw the Germans as guilty. Princip, incidentally, he sort of got lucky. I mean, what was amazing about what actually happened in Sarajevo was that, as one historian put it, it would have been remarkable if he had emerged from the city alive. Because there was a team of no less than 7 assassins at various points in the city. Some of them actually threw bombs, underneath the car. One of the bombs went off and actually injured, an officer who was accompanying the Archduke. And in fact, the Archduke rather selflessly decided he wanted to go visit the injured officer in the hospital. And that's why they changed the route of the car. And then the car eventually stalled when they took a wrong turn and they tried to go into reverse. And it just kind of stopped. And Gavrilo Princip is like in this cafe, one of the assassins, having a drink. Oh, there's the Archduke. Okay. Dead, just like that. Total accident. I mean, yes, it wasn't an accident in the sense that there was a plot, there were a lot of other assassins, but he very well might have survived. Instead, he didn't. And meanwhile, back in Vienna, I mean, it's a little curious. I mean, they're angry in Austria, but in a lot of ways, they're not really that sorry. Because, as I said, he wasn't very popular. In fact, in some ways, it really was the perfect crime from the perspective of the Austrians. In part because Ferdinand had opposed some of the belligerent schemes. Conrad, who is like the equivalent of Moltke on the Austrian side, he's wanted to go to war with Serbia for years. He's just been dying for an excuse to chastise and crush the Serbs. Basically because he thinks that it's true. I mean, the Serbs, they have all kinds of crazy anti-Austrian propaganda. Yeah, I mean, you can tell by these terrorist organizations, they're sort of unsafe and, unstable. They're a real threat to law and order in the monarchy and potentially even to its territory. So he's got good reasons for this. The elimination of Ferdinand then, in just a practical sense, actually helped the war party in Vienna. And Berthold, who was the foreign minister, he was kind of always wavering. Like, he wasn't really against the idea of a war against Serbia, but he wanted the circumstances to be right. Now suddenly the circumstances were perfect. But here's the thing. If Austria had just invaded Serbia right away, like in the flush of anger, then it might not have led to a European war. It might have seemed like the Austrians had cause, right? I mean, they did. The Serbs had just assassinated the heir apparent to the throne. But the problem was Austria was no longer just Austria. It was, after all, Austria-Hungary. It was, as they called it, the dual monarchy. And so they had to take Hungarian interests into account. I don't want to go that far into the details. Basically, they had to do with Romania and Transylvania, and the Hungarians had their own reasons for not wanting the war under these circumstances. Not that they didn't want war, eventually they did, but they didn't really like the idea of a war against Serbia. They had their own designs. Anyway, and so the key figure here is a man called Count Tizsa. He's a Hungarian, and he is the one who sort of like calls out the dogs of war at the very least. He says, look, let's first get our act together. We have to talk to the Germans. We have to pave the way diplomatically, etc. Well, famously, they go up to Berlin. This is another Hungarian, incidentally. There are a lot of Hungarians involved. Count Hoyos. And they send him to Berlin to just basically ask the Germans, look, what should we do? If we fight Serbia, we know the Russians might do something. Are you going to stand behind us? This leads, of course, famously to the so-called blank check. And you should remember that phrase. A blank check, being a check that you leave the amount blank, but you sign it so that someone else can put the amount on. You basically tell them, take whatever you want, or do whatever you want in this case. So that's the idea. That the Germans more or less told the Austrians, it's not literally what they said. But they did basically say, look, stand firm and we'll back you up. The Germans, though, there's all this miscommunication. They think what the Austrians are going to do is like what the Germans would do, which is just invade Serbia. They didn't realize the Austrians were going to like twiddle their thumbs for a couple of weeks and figure out what to do and mull it over and get all kind of hot and bothered about niceties and diplomacy and subtleties. The Germans thought the Austrians were just going to go basically teach the Serbians what. Instead, the Austrians had to delay. They had to delay because of Tizsa. Tija basically says, look, we need a cause. We can't just say we think you assassinated the Archduke. We need to have some kind of legal proof. And more than that, we need to tell the Serbians, we need to give them a chance. Send them an ultimatum, have them have a chance at least to sort of apologize, make amends, investigate the crime, etc., etc. Now, it takes them a while to figure all this out. There's sort of like this interlude where it seems like first you have like a major crisis, and then a lot of Europe starts to relax. And it's in the middle of July that supposedly, and this is the case you hear against the Germans, that supposedly they cooked up this plan, they all burned their private papers to hide it, blah, blah, blah. I don't necessarily buy that. It's true a lot of them burned their papers, but there are a lot of files missing from all of the belligerent powers for July. Well, anyway, this is the time that basically the Austrians decide, yes, we are going to send an ultimatum to Serbia, but they have to figure out how to time it. Timing is very significant. Even beyond the whole issue of mobilization timetables, the diplomatic timing is significant because coming up from the 20th to the 23rd of July, this is something which has been planned for months, is the French presidential summit in Petersburg. The French president Raymond Poincaré, along with René Viviani, are making a major state visit to Petersburg, to the Tsar. Now, Viviani, significantly, because he was actually on the left, he was a radical, not literally a socialist, but kind of pretty close to that side of things. The left had actually just triumphed in these elections like a month previously. Now, they had triumphed so extremely that he was not only prime minister, but he was foreign minister. So he was like both the PM and the FM, both prime minister and foreign minister. Poincaré is the president. So you have pretty much the entire French government, that is, like all the key offices of the French government are now meeting in Petrograd, in Petersburg, with the Tsar, with Sazonov, the foreign minister. Now, as to what they talked about, we don't know, because there are no files. They either disappeared, or they were burned, or they went missing. We don't know. We have little snippets and clues of what we think they talked about. It seems to have come down to something like this. Basically, the Austrians, first they actually wanted to send the ultimatum before the French got to Petersburg. But then they kind of they're running out of time, and then they realize, oh God, if we issue it right on the 20th or the 21st, the French and the Russians, they're going to be literally together. They won't even have to worry about things like wires and telegraphs. They can just literally decide on the spot what to do. In other words, they can coordinate their mobilizations in the flush of anger, if they see this ultimatum and they think Austria is bullying Serbia. And so they decide, well, no, we don't want to do that. So what should we do? Okay, we're going to wait until the French get on board the ship on their way back to Paris, and then we'll issue the ultimatum. That way, the French and Russians won't be able to coordinate, and the Germans even, and they literally did do this, the Germans can jam the signal of the French ship, so the French can't communicate with either Paris or Petersburg. So literally, the French government will be out to sea. That is, the president, the prime minister, and the foreign minister will be literally in the middle of the Baltic Sea with their communications jammed. This is what the Austrians decide. There's one big problem, though. The Russians had broken the Austrian diplomatic cipher. Russian cryptographers, that is, were reading Austria's diplomatic correspondence. Not all of it, but enough of it so that they basically knew what was going down. They didn't know exactly what was in the ultimatum. They knew it was coming, though. So what the Russians do is, I think, again, this is very hard to prove, but they talk with the French, and they decide they are going to issue this kind of anti-ultimatum ultimatum. They're going to threaten Austria not to threaten Serbia. Interestingly, they're just getting ready to do this on the 23rd of July. And in fact, Sazonov sends his ambassador in Vienna, to the foreign ministry to basically tell the Austrians, do not give an ultimatum to Serbia. And the secretary of Berthold, the foreign minister, actually literally tells him, sorry, Berthold's busy. He can't see you. Why was Berthold busy? Well, actually, he had already sent the ultimatum to Belgrade in a sealed envelope with instructions not to open it until 6 p.m. So it was almost like a race. The Russians are trying to threaten Austria, but the Austrians win the race. The Austrians threaten Serbia. Now, what did the ultimatum actually say? I mean, it said you have to do this, 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 and this, or else we will attack you, etc., etc. The one key clause that the Serbians did not accept, I mean, they gave this reply that was full of obfuscation and deceitful language. They basically said, we agree to everything except for the last clause, which was the one where Austria would get to send its own officials to Belgrade, to perform the investigation of the crime. The Russians tell Serbia, basically, we'll back you. The Serbians, don't agree. Now, they have a 48-hour time period. They get this on the 23rd of July at 6 p.m. In that 48 hours, the Russians essentially make the key decisions. At least I think. This is my view of things, not the traditional view. The Russians hold a meeting of the Council of Ministers, a little bit like those crisis meetings I talked about in the first half of the lecture. Many of the same people are there. But if you remember, Kakovtsov is no longer there, right? He was the guy who was always counseling peace. There's another guy called, he's replaced by this 85-year-old who's like half senile. So basically, they've got a tool now as the chairman of the Council of Ministers. There's a guy called Krivoshein. You don't need to remember his name, but he is very, very belligerent. He had actually wanted to go to war in 1912. And he now really controls the council. Sazonov himself, the foreign minister, in 1912, he had hesitated because Kakovtsov had told him, yeah, maybe, again, we can't risk this now. Sazonov had said, yeah, that's true, because actually we haven't got clearance from the French yet. That was in 1912. What has happened this time, though? The last 4 days, the French president, foreign minister, and prime minister had been meeting with Sazonov and the Tsar. So whatever they agreed on, again, they destroyed their files. Presumably the Russians had their own blank check, that is from the French, because they had just met with everyone. Blank check to do what? Well, what Sazonov proposes is this quote-unquote partial mobilization. I talked about that before. The idea that they are only going to mobilize against Austria, so the Germans won't get upset, etc., etc. Well, this is presumably, I think, to reassure other waverers in the cabinet, because Sazonov had been there in 1912 when Kakovtsov had said, look, no matter what you call it, a mobilization is a mobilization. It's going to lead to war. He knew this. I think it's pretty clear what was going on. He knew this. In fact, there's other circumstantial evidence. Sazonov even sent instructions out to the embassies in Berlin and Vienna to start repatriating funds, like all of the money that they held in Germany and Austria. They begin doing this too. And they announced this thing which is very crucial. It's called the period preparatory to war. It's like a pre-mobilization, which most textbooks tell you is no big deal. It's just like, oh, well, they're getting the horses ready, and they're doing this, 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 and this. No. If you look at actually what was happening in Russia, it was pretty much a mobilization. Large-scale mobilization, martial law being declared in all the main cities, communications, everything. They're now controlling embassy communications. They're actually calling up frontier divisions. They're promoting all these people, officers. The whole country is now set in motion. It's a little murky because a lot of it was kept secret. The French knew about it. The British didn't. They literally lied to the British about this because they didn't want Britain to, well, get the right idea. They wanted Britain to have the wrong idea. So Russia begins a large-scale secret mobilization on the 25th of July. The decision was made on the 24th. It begins on the 25th of July. Now, this is very significant because, of course, it's still a week before the war begins. You remember when I told about the mobilization timetables? The Germans was very strict. Remember, they've got 42 days, so they have to move. They cannot lose a minute. They now start to hear from some of their diplomats and agents and spies that Russia has begun secretly mobilizing, which is going to screw up the whole timetable. I mean, it's like seriously dangerous. And so they begin to protest. On the 26th, 27th of July, they go and they protest to Sazonov. They protest to the war minister, Sukhomlinov. They say, look, we think there's a mobilization. The Russians deny it. Straight denials. Lying through their teeth. Meanwhile, the British are the wild card. By this point, it's pretty clear that the French and Russians are on board, that they pretty much committed to war. The Austrians and Germans, the Austrians are already pretty much committing to war against Serbia. They declare war against Serbia on the 28th. The Austrians, of course, would have preferred to just fight against Serbia. They didn't want to fight Russia. They knew, though, that there was a danger that Russia was going to fight. But remember, they have their own blank check from the Germans. And so pretty much everyone now knows that war is on the horizon. The only real question, the wild card, is Britain. Because remember, Britain is not really tied in by like these close treaties. So Britain proposes, they try to mediate. You know, Gray, he proposes a quote-unquote four-power conference. Those four powers would be Germany, Italy, France, and Britain, who were supposed to mediate the Balkan dispute. That is, Austria and Russia weren't even going to be invited. Now, curiously, initially, the Russians respond positively to this. No, I'm sorry, the Germans respond positively to this. Whether because they're looking for a way out or they're just trying to buy time, it's not clear. The Russians and the French refuse even to open negotiations. Meanwhile, the Germans start trying to complain in London that the Russians are mobilizing. But the British just ignore this. They completely ignore these complaints. They don't pay attention. They dismiss them. Britain doesn't believe the rumor that Russia is mobilizing. And so opinion in Britain starts to shift, that is, against Germany and Austria. They think that the whole thing has been concocted by the Austrians, that the Germans are the ones who are really behind it. They begin to think this. That's not to say they're committed to war, but they begin to think this. I mean, there are logical grounds for thinking this. As I said, we know today that the Serbians were guilty. People didn't know that in July 1914. A lot of people weren't sure. They thought the Austrians were like concocting evidence. Britain theoretically was neutral in the Balkan dispute. They had no interest there. What Britain thought, though, was that the Germans and Austrians had concocted the whole crisis. And part of the reason that they thought this was, again, that they were misinformed or that they were deliberately ignoring Russia's mobilization. Well, meanwhile, the clock is ticking. The clock is ticking for the Germans, right? Because if Russia really is mobilizing, they're not entirely sure what's happening. They know Russia started some kind of mobilization, but they don't know quite what it means. Germany, in its own timetable, is going to be completely thrown out of whack. You know, if the Germans lose a day, let alone 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, the whole Schlieffen plan just goes kerplooey, right? Because they have to be in Paris by day 42. If the Russians get a weak head start, because they basically think it's going to take Russia about that long to mobilize. If Russia has a week's head start, then Russia's going to be in Berlin by the time the Germans are in Paris. And so here's where the mobilization timetable argument does begin to kind of matter. It does begin to make sense. The Germans are paranoid about Russia's mobilization. But paradoxically, and here's the kind of questionable bit, the Germans probably should have told Austria to delay going to war against Serbia, but they didn't. They gave the Austrians another blank check. Austria declares war on Serbia. That's on the 28th of July. This is when the Russians finally sort of admit that they're mobilizing, or they say, we now declare partial mobilization against Austria, which is, of course, a total cockamamie lie because they had declared this way back on the 25th of July. They're obviously kind of lying because they don't want Britain to know what's going on. But this is what really sets the clock in motion. Russia now decides, look, the cat's out of the bag. You know, we can't really pretend any longer. So the next day, Russia finally declares what is called, quote-unquote, general mobilization. That is, you know, the call-up of all of the reserves and the initiation of the true full-on mobilization. They hesitate. It's confusing. Like the Tsar, you know, the Tsar has like second thoughts. Do I really want to go to war? Do I not? But the generals basically have started the thing. And by the 30th of July, it's all decided that Russia has mobilized a general mobilization. They're no longer even pretending that they're not mobilizing against Germany. So Germany sends a kind of a 12-hour ultimatum. You have to stop mobilizing. Now, interestingly, the person who tells the Germans that Russia cannot stop its mobilization is not anyone from the war ministry or the Tsar. It's actually the foreign minister, who's supposedly a civilian, who would know about these things. That's Sazonov, who, you know, to me is in some ways the real villain of the piece because he was so deceitful. But Sazonov basically tells the German ambassador, as one of these like dramatic middle of the night meetings, like 3 in the morning or something. He says, we can no longer stop our mobilization. True, he keeps saying mobilization doesn't mean war. That's the kind of thing that the historians argue about. They say Germany's mobilization did mean war because, yes, Germany was going to invade Belgium and France because of the timetable. Whereas Russia could claim, well, our mobilization doesn't mean war because it takes us so long to mobilize. We're not even going to get up to the German border, you know, for the first 3 weeks or something like that. Well, yeah, that argument, of course, makes sense to the Russians and their apologists. But that's not how it looked to the Germans. To the Germans, it looked like you've got this army of like 5 million men mobilizing on your frontier. You know, it looks pretty scary to the Germans. And so you can see why the Germans made the decisions that they did. Still, the Germans in the end were victimized by the rigidity of their own plan and timetable. Literally from the moment that they started the mobilization, they had to cross the border, actually first of Luxembourg and then Belgium. They had to go into Belgium and kind of secure all of the railway lines, secure the fortresses, basically because they're trying to outflank the French army. So that within a day or two, it has become clear to Britain that Germany has violated the neutrality of Belgium. And this is what leads to Britain's own ultimatum on the 3rd of August to Germany to basically withdraw from Belgium. I mean, the Germans, I have to say, they weren't terribly subtle about this. They send a note to the Belgian government, more or less saying, like, by the way, we're about to send an army of almost 2 million men rampaging through your country. We're going to kind of tear through your fields and steal your livestock and all the rest of it. But don't be alarmed. We mean you no harm. We're just trying to, destroy France. And the Belgians respond to this, as the Germans pretty much knew that they would by, declaring war and saying, look, there's no way we're going to let you do this. That said, I mean, the poor Belgians, they really only slowed down the German advance by a couple of days. In fact, in the end, the Germans actually didn't lose any time in Belgium because they had already factored this in. I mean, the fact that the Germans really had no illusions is, it's pretty clear in the documents which show the Germans knew that Britain was going to enter the war. They actually accounted for Britain sending 6 divisions. They also knew that Belgium was going to declare war. So to that extent, the Germans and their own plans were definitely responsible for turning it into a world war. However, the fact that the Germans activated the Schlieffen Plan was made inevitable by the Russian decision to mobilize early and secretly while not notifying the world about it. So this whole question of war responsibility, I mean, I personally think you have to basically factor in both the Russian and the German side. Obviously the Austrians too. I mean, the Austrians kind of started the thing by, attacking Serbia. But what you usually hear in the textbooks is kind of the whole argument about German responsibility, or as it was called in the Versailles Treaty, of course, war guilt. That is, that the Germans were responsible for starting the war. And it's funny, because in the popular literature, you sometimes just hear this thing, oh, well, it's like everyone was guilty. I mean, that's kind of what Barbara Tuchman says in her book. But the more serious historians, at least for the past several decades, have all focused on Germany and then more recently a little bit on Austria for basically starting the conflict. It's strange, though, because basically this book came out in like 1961, blaming the whole war on the Germans. And ever since, everyone's been arguing about this book, and they completely forgot about what the Russians were doing. So that the responsibility really does have to be parceled out differently. Yes, there was an Austro-German plot. Absolutely. Premeditation, blank check, do what you want to Serbia. Absolutely. That's all true. The ultimatum, the Austrians and Germans, they collaborated on that. Absolutely. There's no doubt about that. On the other hand, you have to factor in the decisions made by the Russians to begin their own early secret mobilization back on the 24th and 25th of July. Now, it's not that everyone on both sides wanted the war. Curiously, the Kaiser, the really erratic German emperor, he had second thoughts, like at the very last minute. In part because once he realized that this plan meant that Germany had to invade Belgium and that Britain was going to enter the war, at the last minute he asked Moltke, would it be possible for us to attack just Russia? And curiously, Moltke gave the usual argument of the generals. You cannot alter the plan, right? You cannot change the plan. It's too intricate. You have this number of railway wagons crossing this bridge by this hour. You cannot alter the plan. Curiously enough, though, when this conversation was published after the war in Moltke's memoirs, the chief of the German railway division got really angry because he said, no, we could have done that. In fact, we could have completely altered the mobilization schedule and activated the other plan to mobilize against Russia alone. And he wrote a whole book proving that it was possible. So that in the end, this whole argument about, it's all inevitable because of tactical reasons and timetables, I don't think you can really say that. Moltke decided they couldn't alter the plan because Moltke decided they couldn't alter the plan. It was Moltke's own decision. And then he argued and he told the Kaiser that you cannot do this. And the Kaiser was sort of erratic and weak-willed, and so he got dominated. In the end, the people who really made the key decisions, Conrad on the Austrian side, Moltke on the German side, I write Moltke's name, Moltke the Younger on the German side, I think Sazonov on the Russian side, they're very much guilty of starting the World War. It was not by popular acclamation. It was not as if they put this to a vote of the people or something. They made secret decisions, in conclaves, in war councils, in crisis meetings, which led to the First World War and eventually the deaths of 10 or 12 million people. I think that's about where I wanted to wrap it up today. But just a little bit of a preview. Do not miss Friday's class, because we are going to cover Turkey's entry into the war, which is one of my other favorite subjects. And I really don't want you to miss that. And also, please do read the Tuckman readings, particularly the third chapter, which I want you to read that before Friday. You should read all of them. The third one, which has to do with Turkey's entry into the war. It's about the battle, well, basically the series of battles in the Mediterranean leading to the arrival of the 2 German warships in Istanbul. It's a classic, and I highly recommend it. In fact, I don't just recommend it, I require it. So I hope and I expect that you will all have it read by Friday's class. Thanks. Could not keep back gasps of admiration. In scarlet and blue and green and purple, 3 by 3 the sovereigns rode through the palace gates, with plumed helmets, gold braid, crimson sashes, and jeweled orders flashing in the sun. After them came 5 heirs apparent, 40 more imperial or royal highnesses, 7 queens, 4 dowager, and 3 regnant, and a scattering of special ambassadors from the uncrowned countries. Together they represented 70 nations in the greatest assemblage of royalty and rank ever gathered in one place, and of its kind, the last. The muffled tongue of Big Ben told 9 by the clock as the cortege left the palace. But on history's clock, it was sunset. And the sun of the old world was setting in a dying blaze of splendor, never to be seen again. Well, as you can see, I don't have it memorized yet, but I should. Now, Tuckman, the lady knew how to turn a paragraph. You'll notice how many one-syllable words there are. I think you'll all appreciate that. Well, I'll whet your appetite then. One of the most famous paragraphs in historical literature. Do you know, actually, I used to do this with some of my classes here. I actually first proposed it as a joke, but people took me seriously. I asked them if they could memorize this entire paragraph. I would give them extra credit on the final exam. And one student actually got every single word right. And I gave that student 5 whole points. But then because they spent all their time memorizing this, they didn't do very well in the exam, so it didn't help them. So I think it's a bad idea. I'm not going to do that again. But here it is. The most famous sentence in 20th century historical writing, the most famous paragraph, that is. So gorgeous was this spectacle on the May morning of 1910, when 9 kings rode in the funeral of Edward VII of England, that the crowd, waiting in hushed and black-clad awe. He writes, so too, he decided, was Belgian neutrality. That is, that Germany had to invade France by way of Belgium, thus, as the phrase had it, let the last soldier on the right brush the English Channel with his sleeve. I'll give you maps on Friday. I know you should have maps. The idea then that they're going to envelop Paris from the north and the west. Now, the plan, again, was strategically, shall we say, not very wise, because Belgian neutrality had been guaranteed by treaty signed by all the powers, notably Britain, who had actually created Belgium. So that, in a way, this guaranteed British entry into the war. In a way, but remember, nothing is ever completely decided in advance. And in fact, the plan was not set in stone. The original Schlieffenplan, as I think I wrote down here, was modified substantially by Moltke. Moltke the Younger, as he's called. He was not the son of the elder Moltke, the one who had been the victor of the Franco-Prussian War. He was actually his nephew. But he's called Moltke the Younger, usually in most of the books. Moltke the Younger, the politicians lost control. You know, the generals and the railway technicians had taken over, and so everything came down to the clock. Mobilization timetable. The Germans have to be in Paris on day 42, so there's not a moment to lose, and so they had to mobilize. They had to, they didn't have to. In the end, the decisions were made by real live human beings. Schlieffen himself made this decision, a real live human being who designed the plan. And actually, the second chapter in the Tuckman book, which begins with a character sketch of Count Alfred von Schlieffen, has my other favorite sentence in the book. She's talking about Schlieffen and how single-minded he was. And she said, it is said that once, as the sun was setting on a beautiful day, he and one of his staff officers, they're riding through East Prussia. They come upon this river. The sun is setting, it's shimmering, beautiful scene. And his officer says, look at the river Pregel, I think it's called, sparkling in the setting sun. Schlieffen picks up his glasses and he says, an unimportant obstacle. And she, nice, short, simple words. What she's getting at here is obviously this whole nostalgia for the world destroyed in 1914. To some extent, she did a different thing with her book, with this article on socialism, where she was looking at all the kind of undercurrents of violence and so on. But what's great about her historical prose is it brings out the drama. It brings out the idea that it didn't have to happen. If you think about history, structurally you have alliances and economic forces and politics, socialism as opposed to militarism and nationalism. If you look at it in the big structuralist picture, then yeah, of course it made sense that this war happened kind of roughly when it did. There were these alliances, they were hostile, the Ottoman Empire was falling apart, you had the Balkan Wars, this and that. But history's not really like that. Nothing is ever completely writ in advance. Things didn't have to happen the way they did. Germany did not have to have this Schlieffen plan, which forced Germany to be so paranoid about its mobilization schedule. Yeah, you hear about that too. You hear about the timetables. The war came about because